Fred Wilson, conceptual artist, curator, forward thinker, Renaissance man, rewriter of realities, our understanding of realities. If there ever was an artist to talk about, it would be this man. Wilson was born in the Bronx, New York, which of course is an area that is already full of cultural diversity and a rich one at that. But the general atmosphere of the United States at the time of his birth, which was 1954, of course, in that time you have this movement of Black people airing out their grievances in a multitude of platforms. You have legislation being passed in order to integrate educated spaces of education. You have an increasing amount of people becoming more bold and comfortable with forms of public protest and sit-ins and boycotts and large gatherings, all with the aims in prioritizing Black issues. And at that same time, you have a contrasting group trying to silence the Black voice, trying to in some ways erase the Black identity. So this was the times that Wilson was born in, and this was the atmosphere that he grew up in as a young child. His family moved around a lot. His mother was a music and art teacher, and she would always take him to museums. She would always take him to museums, and he had stated in later interviews that during this time of visiting museums, he had this understanding that surely African American artists exist. However, this was something that he really didn't see. He really didn't see this, and it wasn't until sometime in his high school years where he went to an exhibit that actually celebrated two Black artists in particular that he made the connection of the invisibility that Blacks had within the art world. Moreover, he noted that this process of invisibility, this making the Black figure, neglecting the Black figure, overlooking the Black figure, was a deliberate process. And he saw this more and more as he became more intimate with the workings of museums and the procedure around setting up the museum space. A majority of where his creative process, an area of interest, is developed came from his experience in working as an art installer, freelance teacher, curator, a guard, museum guards, administration, all within different museums around New York City. Wilson has worked at really every major museum in New York City. But during this time is when he really began to recognize the discrepancies in how the museum space was organized. For example, when he worked at the Museum of Natural History, there was this atmosphere of children running around and a bit less serious, a bit less serious tone than what you would think of in a conventional idea of a museum. And this was different. This was distinctly different from what was perpetuated within the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which had an atmosphere of arrogance, this hushed arrogance and pretentiousness, and this separation of viewer and artist. There was this intellectualizing that had to happen for these two parties to relate to each other in any way. Wilson noticed these things and began to inquire about the power the museum space had in creating these types of atmosphere, the power that museum spaces had in developing narratives, especially historical narratives for a particular area, location, community. And with this inquiry is what influenced his initial works with mock museums. And those were kind of his trial, his way of investigating this museum space in the way that he could, of course, because he wasn't in an actual museum yet. But these spaces looked at the hierarchical nature of art, what things are being excluded, what things are being included, and why. It looked at the more or less talked about processes within art, like how art is attained, especially from other places, from other cultures, and how ownership has this forgiveness for imperialist countries. He also looked at how racist behaviors and racist beliefs are explicitly and implicitly encouraged within the museum space and curatorial process. And there really, although he did have the mock museums, there his seminal work, his most notable work of the kind of endeavor that he had been engaging in is seen in his 1992 Mining the Museum project that he did with the Contemporary in Baltimore. Now, the Contemporary saw Wilson's work, and they brought him in to manifest this project of looking at how museum spaces exacted their power and influence over art pieces, specifically what is exhibited and what those exhibits tell about a culture or community, what that means for a culture or community. So after looking at several museums in that area, Wilson decided on the Maryland Historical Society. Partially, this was because it being a historical museum, the nature of this space was to communicate history, true events in history. It was to reflect the reality of past times. And Wilson began to wonder at the one-dimensional story. He began to question the one-dimensional story that he was seeing. And so really all Wilson did in this process, in the creation of Mining the Museum, was look at, as he calls his work, this kind of work that he does, a a process of looking and reimagining perspective. So really all he did was look at what the historical society already had in their collections, in their storage, in their archives, and placed things together, placed artifacts together that would, in an ordinary sense, in a more traditional sense, would not be exhibited together, would not be paired. And in this juxtaposition of seemingly contrasting items, we have this provoking contextualized understanding of history and how it really occurred. Wilson, for this project, posed the question of who is being neglected, who in this community is being neglected, and he went with the history of African and Native Americans. So he incorporated pieces that referenced their life during these times in order to make a more comprehensive conveyance of that period in Maryland. This included placing shackles among the dishware, showcasing whipping posts surrounded by living room chairs, or Klan mask in a suitcase, in a regular everyday dressers. It spoke volumes that these really were the times. And if you're gonna if you're gonna showcase the history of Maryland, this is a part of it. This is a part of it. But the exhibition wasn't just about the recognizing the victimization of minority people that happened during that time. He also included works of slaves, pictures of slaves in a more celebratory light as well. And for the Native American editions, he used these cigar store Indians that apparently, he said in an interview, a lot of museums have, but there isn't so much history about them, and they're kind of one of those pieces that you place in the exhibit and you hope nobody really asks, that but they're still kind of there. They're still included, quote unquote. And so what he did was include them in a way that they can't be ignored. This part of history can't be ignored, and that's what a lot of his work is about, drawing attention to neglected figures. And so with the cigar store Indians, which these specific ones were actually made by a German immigrant using his daughter as a model, they're facing, he had gone out into the community. Even before the project started, he had gone out into the community to actually exchange in dialogue with the people who represent these communities that he's trying to give justice to. And in that process, Wilson noted that he conversed with people that he would otherwise probably not have, for whatever reason. Like, he had, like, the opportunity had not come but for in this way, which made that aspect of this process fed into his project even more, making it another priority of what he tries to do in in the museum space is not only create conversation about these pieces, about the way they're exhibited, about how the museum works and what the museum should consider and how we should expand our understanding of the value of especially cultural, specifically cultural art, the value of cultural art. Not only not only is this dialogue important, but it's important to have cross culturally. So there's this inclusive element to his piece. So going back, Wilson went out to the native people that did still exist within the area, and he asked them their stories, and he got, because these cigar store Indians weren't actually original Native American pieces, he actually brought that element in and got these people's pictures to include in the exhibit. So what you have here are quote unquote fake Indians, people in costume, people pretending, brown face if you will, looking at the authentic Native Americans. And even in the fact that he had to do that he had to bring those people into the space, speaks to how they were erased from this realm in the first place. Now, mining the museum and subsequent works that were similar to mining the museum, but not completely the same, because a lot of what Wilson does is specific to a location. He keeps the location in mind. He keeps the community in mind. He wants to do art for and about the people that live around that location. But mining the museum got a lot of popularity, got a lot of people talking, got a lot of praise, and it got a lot of people thinking. But some of his work didn't receive the same kind of celebration. And this happens with artists, any kind of artist, of course. Some people will like what you do, sometimes they won't like what you do, but especially with socially conscious artists, socially conscious visual artists, the backlash that they will sometimes receive is voluminous. And Fred Wilson's E Pluribus Unum was an example of that, really. The Central Indiana Community Foundation at the time, this is around 2010, at the time, we're trying to make a cultural trail. And in their process of paying homage to a more multicultural perspective, they brought Wilson in. Of course, his work was very known. They brought Wilson in to contribute. And so he said in an interview before that he'd been to Indianapolis before, and the Soldiers and Sailors Monument had always been an intriguing sculpture for him. And that's what he went back to during this time in this project. Specifically, he went back to the freed slave that is featured within the monument. And he started to form questions. And what he says about his work also is that he's not necessarily trying to answer the questions that form in his mind, when he creates, when he makes installations of different pieces, when there's a curatorial project that he's working on. He's not necessarily trying to answer these questions, but what is more important is that he's able to bring these questions into the community, and the community, again, back to the element of creating dialogue, the community then ask themselves these questions and answer them. So Wilson starts to form questions about this man. Who is this man? What is his identity? In what way can this image be repurposed? And so that was the subject that he chose to highlight, chose to emphasize for his project in Indianapolis. Now, while there was a certain expectation for the white members of the community to be against something that was so focused upon a black individual, upon the black body, most of the black backlash and negative reaction that this project received was from black people of color who were divided within themselves between loving the boldness of this project and seeing the good in it, seeing how Wilson is reimagining this image, is taking this traditional image of a downcasted black man, although free, but still downcasted, and reaching for some form of stability coming from his white counterpart. Wilson tries to reimagine this man as reaching, rising towards his own triumph for himself and for his people and his ancestry as well. There was some people, members of the black community, that understood this, and usually those were younger individuals, whereas older individuals, it seemed they were tired of blacks being celebrated in, or not even necessarily celebrated, but focused upon within the context of slavery, of subjugation. They had hoped for something completely different. They did not want another monument reminding them of those of an enslaved period. And notably, much of the backlash that was received could have probably been addressed in a more effective and efficient way if people had actually shown up to the different discussions that Wilson had on this project, because constantly, like he always intends to do when he's working in a new space, he does consider himself as the other. Therefore, the community is the one who has the authority on their own culture, of course. As he made attempts to really facilitate a working dialogue with the community, an understanding with community, a conversation with the community stopped being present. Not that nobody came, but the numbers were few, and those who did come were those who were adamantly against what the project was trying to do. So when you have a dynamic like that, it's that much harder to continue to be innovative in the way that Wilson operates. So eventually, it led to the cancellation of Fred Wilson's project, although there are renderings of what his intention with the piece was. This hurdle, of course, did not stop Wilson's work. He's still very much so considered a forefront as far as artists who are engaged in political and social discussions go. And currently, his work is continued or being exhibited at a few spaces. His black glasswork was just recently shown at Expo Chicago this past September. And black glass, his work with black glass is very intricate, and that within itself is commendable, because that is a very difficult medium to create because of its constitution as well as its color. And so he just recently had that up. His work was also included in a exhibition at Ohio State University called After Picasso, 80 Contemporary Artists. However, that exhibition is currently closed for some reason for the duration of its schedule, but his work was included in that. And also, his work is a part of the exhibit at the Museum of Moderne Kunst Stiftung Ludwig, called To Expose, To Show, To Demonstrate, To Offer Artistic Practices around 1900. And this exhibit questions traditional forms of exhibiting and addressing pressing social challenges of those individual included artists' time. So of course that's right up Fred Wilson's alley. So he really hasn't stopped working over the years. He continues to work in New York as well as internationally. He's been to a plethora of countries, and his work from his most recent back to where he started is still heavily referenced to as transforming the meaning of museum space. Fred Wilson is really a powerful voice, a powerful Black voice, and he refuses to be erased.